Next slide, please. This is what we're going to talk about. That's who I am, just in case you didn't know. I'm trying to establish that I have, the subject matter expertise. So I've sort of built the deck to talk a little bit about why we need submarines, what submarines do, which hopefully then leads into intuitively what we need in the new submarines, and then I work my way through the requirements of the new submarines. So I don't think I really need to sort of stress this point too much. Large geography. The North, certainly in my 3 decades of service, the importance of the North has gone sort of in and out of favor. I would say it's currently on an upswing. So much of what I will talk about is the utility of submarines in protecting the North. Of course, if you can protect the North, you can protect anywhere in the world, and the ranges needed to operate up north make it an expeditionary submarine. That's what I'm saying there. I'm going to let you read this. Carefully chose every single one of these words. It is brilliance distilled to the written form. Those that don't know me, middle child, sarcasm was my self-defense mechanism growing up. I apologize for that in advance.
Still working.
These slides will all be available afterwards as well, so I'm not going to make you read this whole thing. What I'm trying to talk about here is that submarines in and of themselves are not the capability. They're part of a system of systems that works to defend the water column below, on, and above Canadian territorial waters. Next slide, please. And this is more of the same. Is there anyone here that does not have a naval background? No. Okay. What's your background? I won't put you on the spot.
I can tell you.
No, it's fine. So this is submarine operating nations around the world. This is courtesy of Wikipedia. Don't call me out if there's something wrong, but it is plus or minus correct. Next slide. Here's a graph. I put a little arrow in there to show you where we rank, and you will see that it's a pretty small capability, right alongside Chile as our closest operating peer. So what do submarines do, which is really what we're here to talk about. Next slide, please. We do sovereignty patrols. That is, everyone recognize the one on the left? West Coast of Canada. That is a representative sample of contacts on any given day being tracked through the Regional Joint Operations Center. Every one of those dots is an unknown. We know there's something there. We don't know what is there. And that is one of the things that submarines, along with maritime patrol aircraft, excel in. So this picture down here is taken from a Victoria-class submarine, and it represents a fairly standard mission set for the submarines. They go out, they find the unknown, they do what we call a pennant capture, but effectively see the name, compare it to our list. Is it what it's supposed to be? Often you can spoof on AIS, you can change the name. So we just do a verification of that. We do an intelligence collect, and then we feed that in, and it contributes to the overall maritime picture. Next slide, please. This one, I put this one in here a little bit for a sense of humor because Chris and I were around when this was happening, and this was uber secret at the time. You couldn't tell anyone, and then it ended up on the cover of the Toronto Sun. But of course, this is the Turbot War and sort of intercepting the Spanish fishing vessels. And just go back one. Kind of an interesting historical tidbit. The gray ship on the top there is not a Navy ship. And that represents a time where DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, had armed trawlers. So that's a 50 caliber armed trawler that was out also enforcing fisheries and working in conjunction with the submarines. Next slide, please. Intelligence gathering. This is kind of an eclectic set. Aircraft carriers. The bottom one is thermal imaging, and what's interesting about that, and I've of course made this a little bit fuzzy so that I'm not giving it any state secrets, but you can see the hot spots in the ship, you can tell where the machinery spaces are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and there's a fair amount of intelligence that can be derived even at night when you can't see it visually. That's another aircraft carrier off the bottom. That is a British one. And in the top there, also a slightly fuzzy lighthouse of a NATO Navy this is pretty self-explanatory. Going back one. Yeah, just the top left, just for those tracking, is Pathfinders, and the bottom is JTF2. Next slide, please. And then that's Corner Brook on the left and Windsor on the right. This is the war shot that Victoria did in 2012. The intent here being one shot, one hit. You can see that it got hit by one torpedo, and shortly thereafter it sank. A much more challenging for the submariners in the room, much more challenging shot than you think, because the torpedo was acoustic mode off for safety, so you had to line it up, and you had about a 1/4 degree error that you could allow in your fire control solution and still hit it. And if you look at the photo, it always kind of amuses me. We're of course aiming there. We still hit, but anyway, it made for a great story. It was a very challenging thing to do. Next slide, please. So the Canadian submarine history, of course, started here. That's CC1 and 2 in the top left, purchased by the province of British Columbia right in the last couple of days before World War I started, when there was a big concern about the Pacific fleet of the Kaiser's Navy. Had a number of cruisers that were on the loose and unlocated, so the province bought the submarines, then entered into service in Canada. And for those that have been involved in sustaining of submarines, it's a great story. They're slightly different. You can probably tell in the picture. They're not exactly the same. They arrived without torpedoes. Their ballast was out. They couldn't achieve neutral buoyancy. When we did a test dive in Constant Bank on CC1, it touched the bottom. We dry docked it. We sorted out that. We welded some things that had been damaged. Brought torpedoes out. They weren't necessarily submarine torpedoes from Halifax. Embarked them into the boats, and we're conducting war patrols by October. Don't know that we could achieve that today, likely not, but it is a great story of Canadian ingenuity. Of course, no procurement happens in Canada without an obligatory public relations nightmare, and there was a royal commission into this, and if you're curious, the Maritime Museum of Esquimalt has the royal commission available online. It's only about 30 pages. It's a fascinating read to understand what was involved in buying submarines, sneaking them out of the shipyard just before midnight. And midnight, the embargo on arms shipment went in effect, so they sort of snuck out under the cover of dark, arrived here, and were placed in service and operational very short order. Bottom left is one of the fleet boats that operated out here, Grilson Rainbow. Bottom center is the Oberons. The Oberons operated on an interesting drumbeat from a maintenance point of view. They did a refit, 2 years. There was 3 boats, 6-year running cycle. So every 2 years, you would have an opportunity for a boat to have come out of refit and a boat to be going in. We, of course, would take a photo of all 3 of them in the Bedford Basin to commemorate that event, but very seldom did all 3 boats actually operate together. That's a little bit of a public relations photo. And this is one of our submarines up north. That's an Iceberg 2008. Corner Brook 2008. One of the people in this room is in that photo, but actually 2 of the people in the room. So there you go. Next slide, please. So today's Canadian submarine force, I talk a little bit about this. There's another photo, same submarine, also with ice. There is Corner Brook and Windsor operating together out of Halifax. I don't think I'm talking about anything particularly novel here. Next slide. But I did want to talk about the Victoria class. Bought as a capability life extension, not the dream submarines of the Royal Canadian Navy by any stretch of the imagination. The peace dividend, post-Cold War, budget restrictions, all that kind of stuff. We kind of took what we could get. So the white paper of '94 said if you can buy submarines that are available for sale, we checked all the dealerships. This is what was available. And remarkably good submarines despite the press that they have received. 2,600 plus days at sea. Windsor is at sea this week? Next week. Corner Brook will be at sea very shortly as well. So a force that has delivered more than I think we had any right to expect given the investment that we put into it. I've sort of done highlights here of what they've done, but just to say that the Victoria class has been a decent purchase for us. Next slide, please. Put this up here really to illustrate the upgrades that have gone into the boat. So the boats will operate as close to 50 years of life as we safely feel like operating them. A lot of the underlying infrastructure is old and dated and requires replacement, but there is a bunch of new stuff in there. And I've done sort of a collection of things that are new. That is, of course, the 7AT, Mark 48 7AT torpedo being loaded in the middle. The photo of the left, anyone recognize it? That's Yokosuka, Japan. That's Shikudami in there. And the one on the right is in Italy, and that is Windsor. So these are kind of the challenges that we started by going into the Canadian Patrol Submarine project with. I'll let you read them. No big surprises. 4 boats is not enough to sustain a fleet, and when you've divided it from two coasts apart, it makes it very challenging, from everything from qualifying people through to sustainment, spares management, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The range and endurance, the boats were designed to operate, come out of the UK, go over to the GIUK gap, do a patrol, and head back in. So they have a fairly short range. We've maximized that as much as we can. They can effectively cross the Atlantic with correct snort management and that kind of stuff, but that's about the range. That's all good there. These are the design drivers, or the drivers for the new boats.
Admiral,
Yeah.
the previous slide, the
Go back.
bottom bullet was about people, and you said that the boats need upgrades to make them.
They do.
Yeah. So what specifically is feasible for the Victoria class?
So these existing challenges are to drive for the future.
Okay.
The Victoria class is not significantly upgradable from a sustainment of life on board point of view. We've done a little bit of change, not much. The galleys are being replaced. That is one of the big changes, but the actual quality of life, everything from the bunks to the mess spaces, is pretty much what it came as. And I was first crew on Victoria, and as we went over, we were sort of fed this line about how much better quality of life was going to be on the Victoria class and all this kind of stuff. And I still remember 25 years ago walking through that boat. Surprise! I'd come off at Jibla, was my last boat, and a Jibla is more comfortable than Victoria any day of the week. They were designed as GIUK gap fillers, short range, on patrol and off patrol, 1 and 2 watchkeeping. They're just not super comfortable. But what more important than the comfort is the things that the crews now have a right to expect. So we would expect a gym on board. We'd expect laundry facilities. We would expect some way of being in touch on a 2-way basis, semi-routinely with home. So internet-based communications, that kind of stuff. Those are the things I'm really talking about. Of course, more space. Showers would be awesome. Permanently fixed showers. Like that, those kind of really big. I'm not talking luxury accommodations, but improving the people space. Yes, Harper.
At the last little bit of the sentence, talking about Arctic capability and complying with environmental regulations, which, as we know, tend to be changed and make it more difficult as time goes by. And has there been any attempt to exempt national?
So there hasn't. That's not to say that that's impossible. And I stayed away from talking about specific MARPOL regulations, but when we operate the Victoria class up north right now, we operate it on a 0 discharge basis. So sewage and stuff like that is not a big deal, but it's
going to war in the day.
absolutely. And the restrictions on the Victoria class operating north of 60 is a question of days, not weeks. Just the water alone from when you raise and drain the induction system, so that the system that brings air into the submarine fills up your oily bilge fairly quickly. So that is what we're talking about there. There'll need to be oily water separators of a pretty high degree of quality. There'll have to be storage tanks, so on and so forth. But it is a real limiting factor, and much more so than the ability to punch through ice or something like that. Next slide, please. Next slide. All right, so now we're getting into the part that you actually showed up for. So a fairly lengthy way of saying each of the words in there, of course, has purpose, written in the days before ChatGPT, so it's possibly wordier than it needs to be. But how does this break down into specifics? Next slide, please. How many submarines, of course, is one of the very first questions we start with. We did a very initial fleet size analysis. I'll let you read it. For those that have been following the project since the early days, you'll notice we very deliberately say 8 or 12, not 8 to 12. And that's a little bit of a difference from the way we normally talk about project sizes. And the reason for that is it really is in groups of 4 that you deliver a capability. If you buy 9 submarines, that only still gives you the 2 deployable submarine thing. So that's kind of the math that we're using on this. Next slide, please. But of course, there is innovation space. You may have a submarine design out there that is uber reliable and never needs to be refitted, and then maybe we only need 8 to get 3 lines. So we have presented the space. This is what we're saying we need. We need 3 available for continental defense, 3 for, in effect, in older speak, high readiness, normal readiness, and maintenance. And the bidders will have the opportunity to say, well, I could do it with 10 boats, or I'm going to need 14. We're not constraining it to a size. And that is one of the slight nuance changes from the 8 to 12 that we used to talk about.
But you're not limiting it. The bottom number is 8 still?
Yeah. Which is for an Atlantic Pacific presence. What we've said is that if you go with 4 boats again, you're no longer going to be able to do the 2 coasts, because honestly,
It doesn't
we've
work.
struggled. Right. Yes?
Did the change there derive from internal to HQ or come into as a response to an RFI or something?
No, so the RFI has gone out. It was all the responses were received on mid-November, 14th of November. Knowing that I was going to be speaking publicly, I have not read the RFI replies because I don't want to be wiki-leaking stuff that is not mine to share. No, it was just the the project team at the beginning was one person doing it on the side of their desk while they did another very busy job. Not allowed to share it with anyone. Cabinet and that one person were the only, and the commander of the Navy were the only people that were read in. The documents were all hand numbered and signed, like all that level of secrecy. Obviously, as we expanded the people that knew about it once it was approved, there has been different thinking that has come in, and this is one of the evolutions that we've gone with. Maybe that one person didn't have all the right answers, so this is what we're trying to do. Personally, I think 4 to 1 is probably the right ratio, and if we look at open source data for our allies, it's pretty much where everyone is. But the innovation space is available there. Next slide, please. So here's the key requirements, and I'm going to sort of work through each one of these requirements. Next slide, please. So we'll start with this one. Next slide. So how did we come up with the 3,500 nautical miles? Here is some of the distances, and here on the coast, I think most people would appreciate the vast distances to get up into the Arctic, particularly from the west coast. You know, going up and around is much longer than people think. So when we first started talking about this, I used to have a slide like this, and I also had a slide that showed the distances to Europe, but I think it resonates more if you look at this to get up to, from the west coast, to get up to, let's say, Anchorage is 1,400 nautical miles. And that's not really into the Canadian Arctic yet. And that's one way, of course. So this is what drives the range requirement. The boats have a long way to go, and when they get there, they need to be self-sustained, which drives a large boat, a capable boat with fairly large fuel tanks. Next slide. Arctic capability. Next slide. So this is the Arctic. I used 2 different presentations there. The Northwest Passage is the one on the far left. And why does that matter? So ice is melting. Since we I first went up to the Arctic about 20 years ago, 25 years ago. There was ice everywhere. It was kind of what you would picture it. I last was in the Arctic 3 years ago doing ice trials on one of the icebreakers. We steamed around for 6 weeks looking for 1 mile of 1.5 meters deep ice to do this one particular trial on. The Arctic is melting, and it's melting faster than we think. So there will be much more open water areas up there, which will drive more shipping, more interest from adversaries and allies alike. It made the press earlier this year, or sorry, we're in 2024, late summer 2024. We had a number of interested adversary navies up there operating their coast guards. We sent Regina up, which kind of made the press around here. But that stuff happens all the time. And so the intent that I'm trying to show here is the Arctic is opening. It's going to have more presence, and when it has more presence, it requires more self-defense. Next slide, please. One of the things that has changed, and notwithstanding the photos I put in of Victoria sinking Concord, the USNS, you need a scalable approach to inflicting lethal force now. And with the rules of engagement that we have, you often want a weapon that's, can do a disabling shot. You might want to be able to do a warning shot. You might want to just disable the ship temporarily. You need a scalable response, and a heavyweight torpedo, as awesome as it is, only does one thing, depicted in the middle. And it does it from a relatively close range. We now need the ability to reach out much further and have an approach where maybe we just take out the bridge, maybe we take out the engine room, maybe we attack something on land. So all of those things are going to drive a different weapons load. For sure, there will be some kind of land attack capability fitted to the submarines. Probably, if I was going to guess, something similar to what's going on the River class destroyers, but that is also open for negotiation. Next slide, please. I just put this in here because I can't really talk a lot about this, but you can drive your own discussions on this. The Canadian Navy has just taken delivery of something called the Remote Mine Detection System, which is pretty much that system there, a little bit different with different brands on it. But it is the future, and the ability to go into minefields. No longer do we send submarines and ships into minefields. It's about standing off, sending things in that you can afford to lose. So the ability to operate autonomous systems is more than just having a torpedo tube that is capable of embarking them. You need some kind of control mechanism, you need some comms links, and sometimes you need a way to recover them. So the future capability will require that. This is not a sort of Cadillac gold plating of the requirements. Every available SSK with AIP on the market can do this to a certain extent. Next slide. The dates, I'll go back, sorry. It did kind of make the news that we were expecting delivery in 2037. We're hoping to have initial operating capability in 2037, which drives a delivery of a couple of years earlier than that. And that, of course, is driven by the age of the boats. And initial operating capability will be boat delivered through trials, weapon capability tested, and then the follow-on boats will arrive. So that's what we're defining as IOC. Next slide, please. So a little bit of, I call it myth busting. We often read in the press from interested observers that you need a nuclear submarine to punch through the ice. You don't punch through the ice. That would be bad in a nuclear submarine as much as in a diesel-powered submarine. We have operated submarines since the 40s under the ice. In fact, I found a YouTube documentary about a World War I submarine that was bought by an investor in 1926, tried to go up to the North Pole under the ice with a big screw. Didn't work. But they all lived, surprisingly. But we have been operating, starting with A-boats in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, American fleet boats off of Greenland. Conventional, very short-range boats have been going under the ice for years. It is a possible thing to do in a conventional submarine. The way you surface through the ice is you look for apollonia, and we know where they are. There's a number of general areas where apollonia naturally occur. You survey it by going back and forth using high-frequency active sonar to look up. Pretty standard stuff. Once you've found a spot, you catch a stop trim, and you very slowly rise until you're touching the ice. And once you're settled out touching the ice, you blow main ballast. And then that gentle pressure, you push through the ice. It's nothing about speed or endurance or any of that kind of stuff. Nuclear submarines have their place, and they bring a phenomenal capability. Punching through the ice is not one of those capabilities. And my argument would be that nuclear submarines are too expensive for what Canada needs. They're intensely expensive. If we look what one of our allies to the south is doing, there's somewhere around $400 billion for 8 boats. I think that is too expensive. Considering the submarine is a component in a system of systems, I think an air-independent propulsion boat gives us the same stuff, minus the one big capability that a nuke boat brings is the sprint speed. So if the boat is operating off of Greenland and we need to send it to the Baltic, a nuclear submarine, of course, will get there faster. Barring that one super useful ability, an air-independent propulsion boat will be able to operate. So that is myth 1.
Could I just make
Absolutely,
a comment, please? During the nuclear submarine program, the surfacing through the ice was made to be a very big issue with respect to the French proposal, given that they had, as far as we know then, hadn't had a lot of experience doing what you described, but one would suspect that they also, with the conventional boats, may well have had some experience. I just don't know. So they did a tremendous amount of trial work in the St. John, Newfoundland Memorial University tanks with ice cover and all the scale and so on and so forth. And pretty quickly, I think we're able to illustrate that with some pretty minor modifications, they could do exactly what you described. But it, I think, was one of those areas that came back to haunt us, in that you knew that one proponent has done it a lot, and you're talking about somebody else who's never done it. And therefore, I would expect you might run into that sort of mindset in your present work and program. And it would be a good area to really be as upfront and as transparent as you can to try and put that big debate to bed so that it doesn't continue to be
No, I
one of those
absolutely
worrying
agree with you.
factors.
The Portuguese Navy operate Type 214 air-independent propulsion SSKs, about a 2,000-ton submarine, and they operated last year under the ice between Greenland and Canada with that small AIP boat. It is possible. They made a big splash. Some of you may have seen it in the news. One of our officers was on board. But no, it's absolutely, and it's a recurring narrative I often read in the Canadian military online, about how if you don't have a diesel boat, you can't operate up north. It's just not true. Okay, Mark 48. And when I phrase this as myth busting, is because these are the feedbacks that I've been getting, and people go, of course, we're not going to change the design, we'll take whatever it is, except for their interest of choice. Mark 48 is one of those. We would never walk away from the Mark 48 torpedo, people believe. That's not true. The Mark 48 torpedo, we bought the Mod 4 at the end of the 80s. It operated on the Oberon class. We updated that in 2010 to the 7AT. Those that are following along with the math will realize that that torpedo will be plus or minus 50 years old when this class comes in. Maybe we go with a modern Mark 48. Maybe we go with something else. I think a heavyweight torpedo, as long as it comes from one of the Western allies, they're pretty much interchangeable. So the Mark 48 is not a secret, hidden Navy high-level mandatory requirement. The torpedo that it comes with would be good enough for us. Off the shelf, but it will include other changes. Communications equipment is one that is frequently used. Software-defined radios is kind of here to stay. All of our allies use software-defined radios. They don't all buy their radio sets from the one large ally just to the south of us, but they're all interchangeable. We can do the same. The way you encrypt communications is with the cryptological keys. Software-defined radio allows you to do that just nicely. We are not looking to change pretty much anything. As it comes out of the factory or off the factory line, that will work for us. Generating crews is the other one that is frequently talked about. And it is, the truth of the matter is right now we have 2 crews. Windsor has a crew, Corner Brook has a crew. There are about, how many do you have now? About 400 submarine qualified across the enterprise?
Yep.
So 400 people, all ranks, which includes Alex and I. So not enough, but the way you generate crews is you reliably put submarines to sea, you run people through their on-the-job training packages, and you develop them. We went from 2 O-boats to 4 Victoria class pretty quickly. We learned a number of lessons on how we did that. We would do it a different way going forward, but we can generate the crews. I'm convinced of that. Next slide, please. So this is the delivery program. More just sort of summarizing what I've talked about already. Next slide, please. This is the way forward. So I think there's a couple of interesting things in here. It is my belief that there is no ability to build submarines in Canada today. Could we do it? I mean, as a nation, we built the Canadarm. Like, of course, technologically, Canadians could do it. It would be horrendously expensive and extremely difficult to do. And for that reason, buying offshore would make the most sense to me. Obviously, they would be maintained here. There's no point in a conflict having a boat that needs to be maintained overseas somewhere. But it needs to be an off-the-shelf design. The 2035 that I keep harping on as first delivery is driven by the very pragmatic fact that the Victoria class will start to pay off at that point. And we will go from 4 boats to 3 boats to 2 boats to 1 boat in a fairly short order. So the boats need to arrive, or we have a capability gap. And once you're out of the game, it will be a challenge to get back into it. Not an insurmountable challenge, but a pretty close to insurmountable challenge. The 3 lines of taskings we talked about. Continental defense. The second line in there is kind of a key nugget. The boats need to be able to operate up north without support. It's not about building submarine support bases in the Arctic. It is about going up, remaining undetected, and coming back. Now, why is that? Building in the north is extremely difficult. It's a protected ecological zone. It's hard to get construction permits. Everything you resupply with up there has to get shipped up there and shipped back. And the third and possibly most important reason is when a submarine leaves home port, you want it to be undetected. And if you're tying it to a mothership or to known forward operating bases, you just draw the furthest on circles and you pretty much know where those boats are, defeating the 3 weeks it took to get up there. So for those reasons, the boats need to be self-sustaining. They need to be long range. And the last one is the under ice bit. We're not picturing a Nautilus style over the North Pole, weeks and weeks and weeks under the ice type of operation. You only really need to go under the ice if there's something to go under the ice to look for. And there are known choke points on the edges of the ice. A lot of the Arctic is fairly shallow. Those that haven't been up there, like very shallow. So there's a bunch of areas that they can't operate. You know the areas they can operate. Operating in the marginal ice zone is probably good enough for a lot of the employment. The ability to go under the ice and chase something down or transit from one ice-free zone to another. So we're talking a couple of days capability under the ice type of thing is entirely achievable with an AIP boat. Next slide.
So, Admiral,
Yes. Go back.
That bullet about three and fourth generation simultaneously. What does that really mean? Let's say
Okay.
you've got
Okay.
3 on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, poor wording on my part. This talks about 2 lines of effort, if you will. 3 boats that are doing exercises. 4th generation is sort of code speak for building crews, practicing, testing new equipment, that kind of stuff. And then the other one is for continental or global. So high readiness, fully equipped, weapon certified boats deployed somewhere, doing the business. 3 close, doing normal readiness training, possibly working their way up to the first 3, or possibly working their way down from the first 3, but 3 boats that aren't fully worked up at high readiness, and then the remainder are in maintenance. And the simultaneously refers to you need 3 deployed, 3 at home at the same time. So 6 boats at sea. Yes?
Given the very tight 2035 delivery, because I thought earlier in the conversation we said it took 15 years to get a submarine built, is there any possibility that if you've got someone that's got a block of submarines and they're building subsequent blocks for us, that you could lease 1 or 2 for that gap period and then return to sender after you get the Canadian ones?
Anything is possible. So the way procurement works is we set out the high-level mandatory requirements. We put out the RFIs. Maybe someone has suggested that. I haven't read the RFI replies yet. We wouldn't be opposed to it. And those that are watching the news, the Coast Guard, not the Coast Guard, the RCMP just took delivery of 2 Blackhawks. Is anyone following how that was done?
Yeah, without authorization, well, it was done, but it was not.
So they're leases.
It wasn't cleared by Parliament.
Right. So
Millions
they
of
leased,
dollars spent.
leased the interim capability. Anything, Asterix is another example of an interim capability that could sort of prevent it. 15 years was based on taking the press release of the starting up of about 15 Navy's projects and the date of the first boat entering service. That's how we came up with the 15 years. The project started in 2020, so just in the nick of time to achieve 15 years. But that's if everything goes remarkably fast and right. Thus far, the project, I would say, is tracking on the relative for that delivery. But yeah. Yes?
Admiral, you mentioned that we applied for the RFI back.
There.
Do you have any idea when we're sending out an RFP?
I don't. I could not even speculate, I'm sorry. But sort of what we've said is we need to be in contract 28-29 so that the boat's final design is done, go into build 3, 4, 5 years depending on the manufacturer to build the boat, put it in the water, do the builder trials, and bring it back for 35. So that's sort of the timeline there. And in government procurement world, being in a contract in 3 to 4 years there's a lot of ground to cover between here and there. I will say that they seem pretty committed. And rates since 2020, there has been enthusiasm. There are a number of covert, very public elected officials that they're covert in their love of submarines, I should say, that have publicly supported us. Even the Prime Minister at the naming of the first JSS talked about defense investments in Canada, and the very first project he mentioned, sort of off the cuff ad-libbing, was submarines. So there is support there, but it does require a whole of government approach. PSPC has been very involved in this. I said Industry Sustainment Economic Development Canada, so the people with the industrial offset, very involved. TSB has been very involved, and thus far it looks promising. Admiral Anderson would have more experience than me with a large-scale submarine project and could tell you that things can go wrong very quickly as well. Just like this. So this is sort of the next steps. And next slide. That's it. That's questions.
No breakdown of the actual